Today we're taking a hard look at two of the most iconic stories from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're going to examine the source material's claim that the official narratives of Private Jessica Lynch and Corporal Pat Tillman weren't just wrong, but that they were psychological operations, deliberately built to sell a war to the public. Okay, before we dive in, let's get on the same page about a key term, a PSYOP. A psychological operation isn't just about spreading bad information. It's a strategic weapon. It's about engineering a story to get a specific emotional reaction and ultimately to make people act a certain way. Keep that definition in your back pocket because it's central to everything we're about to unpack.
And this quote right here, it really gets to the absolute heart of the argument we're exploring today. The claim is that what we see as news during a war is often much closer to a movie production. Events aren't just being reported, they're being scripted, directed, and edited to serve a much larger purpose.
So let's open our first case file. We're going back to the very beginning of the Iraq invasion in March 2003. The war wasn't the easy cakewalk that had been promised, and according to our source, the military desperately needed a hero story to control the headlines, and they found it in a 19-year-old supply clerk from West Virginia.
You know what's really wild is how fast this all happened. Look at the timeline. March 23rd, the ambush happens. Just over a week later, there's this dramatic filmed rescue. And then, boom, 2 days after that, a major newspaper publishes the story that would define her for millions. A story that, as we're about to see, had almost nothing to do with what actually happened.
And this is where the two stories just completely diverge. The myth, which was reportedly shaped by Pentagon officials and printed on the front page, was a total Hollywood blockbuster. A female Rambo, fighting to the last bullet. But the reality? She was a 19-year-old kid whose Humvee crashed, knocking her unconscious instantly. Her M16 rifle jammed with sand. She never fired a single shot. All her terrible injuries came from the crash, not from combat.
The story of her captivity also went in a completely different direction than the official narrative implied. Instead of being held by brutal enemies, she was being cared for by an Iraqi doctor, Harith al-Hassona, who gave her incredible medical treatment. He put her in the hospital's only specialized bed. The staff even donated their own blood for her. And get this, the source claims the Iraqi staff actually tried to drive her back to American lines in an ambulance, but they were fired on by U.S. troops and had to retreat.
So what about that dramatic rescue? Well, according to the source, it wasn't a combat operation. It was a film production. The Iraqi military had already left the hospital the day before. There was zero resistance, but a team of special forces still staged a full-blown raid, complete with a combat camera crew using night vision. And that's the footage, all green and grainy and dramatic, that was blasted out to the entire world. It was the perfect ending to a story that was almost entirely fiction.
Now for our second case file, which really builds on this theme, if the Jessica Lynch story was about inventing a hero out of thin air, the story of Pat Tillman, as our source presents it, is about hijacking the legacy of a real hero, because the truth of how he died was just too inconvenient. To really get this story, you have to understand who Pat Tillman was. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a symbol. A famous NFL star who walked away from a multi-million-dollar contract to serve his country after 9/11. He was, quite literally, the most powerful recruitment tool the military had. His story was priceless. And here we go again. The official story versus the ground truth. They're like two different universes. The fiction, written up in a Silver Star Medal citation, paints this picture of a heroic last stand against the enemy. The reality was a tragic, horrific, chaotic case of friendly fire. He was shot from only 10 yards away by his own guys, all while screaming his own name, "I'm Pat fucking Tillman," trying to get them to stop. And according to the source, this wasn't just a mistake they tried to hide later. This was a coordinated cover-up from the very beginning. Within 24 hours, key evidence, his uniform, his body armor, even his personal journal, was illegally burned. Statements from his fellow Rangers were changed by their superiors, and for 5 weeks, his family and the entire nation were fed a lie, even while the commanders who knew the truth were writing up that fake award citation. Now, if you're looking for the smoking gun, the source points right here. This is a classified memo from none other than General Stanley McChrystal. It shows that the highest levels of command knew it was highly possible Tillman was killed by friendly fire just days after his death and a full 5 days before his nationally televised memorial service, where he was celebrated as a hero killed by the enemy. But you can't keep stories like this buried forever. Eventually, the truth starts to claw its way out. And on one single day, April 24th, 2007, the very people at the center of these manufactured stories finally got their chance to set the record straight, under oath before the U.S. Congress. First up was Jessica Lynch.
In her own words, she completely rejected the legend that had been built around her. She basically said, look, the American people are smart enough to find their own heroes. They don't need the government feeding them elaborate lies.
And at that same hearing, Pat Tillman's brother Kevin, who was also an Army Ranger serving nearby when Pat was killed, delivered this just absolutely blistering takedown. He said the lie wasn't just an insult to his family. Its real purpose was to deceive the entire country. They were trying to hijack his brother's legacy for their own purposes.
So what was the response from the top brass? When the generals, including McChrystal, were called to testify about who authorized all this, they were suddenly struck by a wave of amnesia. Over and over again, the answer was, I don't recall, I don't remember. In the end, not a single senior officer was ever held accountable.
So what's the final conclusion from the source material? That these two stories weren't mistakes, they weren't anomalies, they were a blueprint. A standard operating procedure where soldiers' personal tragedies are hijacked and turned into propaganda to fuel patriotic support for a war.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really unsettling question. If war is treated like a movie, as this source alleges, with scripts and actors and special effects, then the most important thing we have to ask ourselves is, who's in the director's chair?